Good evening, and thank you to everyone for taking time out of their very busy schedules to join us tonight. My name's Glenn Cowan, and I'm the convener of the Amnesty International Nagoya Multicultural Provisional Group here in Aichi, Japan. And I will be moderating tonight's online seminar entitled Not Drowning But Fighting: How Climate Change Impacts Human Rights in Fiji. Joining us tonight will be Lavitanalagi Seru, a climate, LGBTI and gender activist from Fiji, who will be joining us tonight to discuss the concepts of climate change and human rights and how these particular concepts affect each other, and basically through the prism of life in Fiji. Another purpose of tonight's online seminar is to also introduce the organisation of Amnesty International, Amnesty Japan, and in particular three groups, three English-speaking and multicultural groups based here in Japan, the Amnesty International Tokyo English Network, or ITEN in its acronym form, the Amnesty International Osaka Multicultural Group, or the Osaka 95 Group, and the group that I'm a proud member of, the Amnesty International Nagoya Multicultural Provisional Group. I'd like to start tonight's online seminar by bringing up the results of a survey that Amnesty International commissioned last year. These results of said survey, which were released on the 10th of December last year, which was International Human Rights Day, concerned basically the most pressing issues for people who are aged 18 to 25. Amnesty conducted this survey across 22 countries and across 100,000 people in the age demographic that I just mentioned. And one of the findings that came about that was incredibly, striking was that 41% of the people surveyed said that climate change was the most pressing issue one of the most pressing issues facing the world today. It was for the next most frequent answer that was given within this particular survey was pollution at 36%. Now, some people who may be tuning in tonight may be thinking, what is the actual relationship between human rights and climate change? Many people may think these are mutually exclusive concepts. Indeed, many people in the developed North when they think of the concept of human rights, may think of what we would call civil and political rights. Say, for example, the right to free speech, the right to free assembly, the right to vote, the right to a trial in front of a jury of one's peers. What we're hoping to explore tonight with the discussion that we'll be having with Lagi is how actually climate change does impact human rights in a very, very concrete way. And hopefully we can walk away tonight with a better understanding of the link between these two particular concepts, but also as well, hopefully we can walk away feeling a lot more empowered and with a greater sense of solidarity in that and how we can actually approach this problem moving forward. So I'm assuming that everyone who will be joining us tonight will have an idea of what Amnesty International was, and I won't say was because we're still going, but has an idea of what Amnesty is. The best way that I could explain it is that Amnesty is a collection of people worldwide, a committed collective of people worldwide who take injustice personally. It was originally founded in 1964 by British lawyer Peter Benenson, who was inspired to found the organisation based on him reading an article whilst riding the London Tube or London subway about two young men who had been arrested for having a toast to freedom in Portugal. So originally the work that Amnesty did involved violations of human rights on an individual level and persecution of human rights defenders. And many people who have been involved in Amnesty will know of the Urgent Action Network, where particular cases from around the world are highlighted and letters are sent to politicians and people involved with these particular cases to basically end whatever discrimination, persecution, whatever you may call it, is that this is ended. But as time's moved on, Amnesty has also spread its wings. But I guess also getting back to what we're talking about with individual cases, Amnesty has basically had some breakthroughs in this regard. Many people may have heard of Narges Mohammadi, an Iranian death penalty activist who recently was released from prison. We also may know the Bahraini and Australian refugee Hakim Al-Araibi, who was issued with a red notice whilst he was on his honeymoon in Thailand. And it was through the intervention of Amnesty International that was actually lifted. So a lot of the work we do is very, very important. It's very, very vital. And we like to believe that we are making a difference, every single day through the work that we do. But we've also expanded into more, I guess, broader campaigns. A good example would be, say, for example, in Australia, during the same-sex marriage plebiscite in 2017, Amnesty was an active backer of the plebiscite, which was ultimately successful in legalising same-sex marriage in Australia. But here in Japan, at a local level, we're also involved in the Love Beyond Genders campaign, which is hoping to establish an anti-discrimination law for those who have, I guess, a non-normative sexual preference or gender identity. Also, the I Welcome campaign, which is a worldwide campaign aimed at increasing the acceptance of refugees and asylum seekers, which has also been applied here in Japan. And also the Brave campaign, which is based around human rights defenders, female human rights defenders worldwide, and advocating for those particular activists. It's now in 80 countries, and its work has been honoured in the past by being the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977, and in 1978, the following year, Amnesty also received the UN Prize in the field of human rights in 1978. Now, Amnesty is funded by individual donations and financial members, and I cannot stress strongly enough that being a member of Amnesty is an absolute privilege for me. And I'd suggest if we spoke to any Amnesty member, they would feel the same. Now, for people who are in Japan watching this, we would also recommend that if you are in, Kanto, Kansai, or Chubu, that you speak English, that you could get along to some of the meetings, basically within 3 of the groups that I mentioned earlier tonight. So what we're going to do now is we're going to be introducing 3 of these groups. So one being the Amnesty International Tokyo English Network, the Osaka 95 or Osaka Amnesty International Osaka Multicultural Group, and the group that I'm involved with, which is the Amnesty International Nagoya Multicultural Group. So to start off with, I would like to extend a very hearty welcome to the great and powerful Marian Hara, who will now introduce the Amnesty International Tokyo English Network. So Marian, the floor is yours. You're muted at the moment.
That wouldn't be good. Great and mighty. I am not so sure about that, but I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Glenn, for the introduction. My name is Marian Hara, and I'm an active member of ITEN, which is Amnesty International Tokyo English Network. I think we have some slides coming up, so I'm going to show a few slides and say a little bit as we go through. Basically, well, the group in Tokyo actually is a very long-lived group. It started in the kitchen of a lady who gathered people together to write letters with it was open to everybody, talking in English. She was actually German. And what people were doing back in the beginning was writing letters about prisoners of conscience, as they're called, POCs. And as Glenn was saying, Amnesty is covering many, many different issues. So this is who we are. And as is written there, everybody's very welcome to join us. The kind of issues that we cover depend on what's happening in the world, and also depends on the interests of individual members. So I was just making a check of the kind of things that we've been looking at in Tokyo. And I would say one is refugees and asylum seekers. Then gender issues are very big. We're very concerned about the death penalty, which I'll mention later. One of our members is really informed and interested in the problem of the arms trade. And of course, now the climate crisis, which has become a major program within Amnesty International. So next slide, please. Thank you. So I just want to run through some of the things that we have done. Things are really changing because we are now online. But we, in the past, have had many movie nights where people come together, watch a film connected with some kind of human rights issue, and have some discussion after, and have a great evening together. Next, please. So letter writing is kind of central. We write letters to governments and support people who cannot support themselves. In many countries, you're not able to protest against the government. And so writing to other countries is a very big thing that we do. And we have guest speakers and we sit around and talk about these things because it's something we all care about. Next, please. Yeah, so we've also done various things at different times. This is spreading information about human rights and Amnesty's activities by turning up at school events and university fairs and getting people, you can see the people here signing some kind of a petition. We have many petitions going on all the time, as you can find on the Amnesty website. Next, please. Yes, oh, this was a great one. There's an event in Tokyo called the Yamathon, where you run around. I did not do it, but you run around the Yamanote line, killing yourself in the process and raising some money, which goes to a good cause. And this was not for Amnesty, but we were raising money to support some other event. And I just turned up for the lunch, which was pretty good. Next, please. Yes, now for the last year, until Corona, in fact, one of our big things has been fundraising with Pub Quiz. We've been running these in Shibuya, and very sadly, we are not able to do that at the moment. We just don't think it's safe. We're thinking of doing one online, but this is a great way to get together. The important thing of being in a group like this is learning stuff, sharing ideas, and having fun. Next slide. Yes, and we take part in all kinds of campaigns. So this was one for refugees where people post pictures of themselves. The one in the middle is a man who's struggling against unfair arrest, struggling to get a retrial. Some members turned up to support them, and we take part in the Gay Pride for the last few years. I think we have one more to come. One more slide. Yes. So right now, we haven't been so active in meeting recently, but we're moving into online events. And recently, we are very interested in the death penalty. The old man you see in this picture is a record breaker. He was the longest serving death row inmate. He has been released. He was released 6 years ago. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court has not yet permitted his retrial. And so he could be taken back into prison. He's 84. His 87-year-old sister has been fighting for him. And Amnesty has been supporting this, and many of our members too. So we're going to have an event to explain and discuss this, and this will be bilingual. So there's our website. We will share that at the end, and we hope that you will join us both at this event, and also please check out the I-10 group and come along and let's do something together. Thank you very much. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Marion. So moving along, we're going to be going in order of city population size. I'd like to introduce another convener of a group here in Japan, Zdenek Schmergel. So Zdenek is, at the time of this is being recorded, is trying to revive the Osaka 95 group, and basically they're trying to transition that into being an English-speaking group. Zdenek, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and please let me start our visual presentation. So, as Glenn mentioned, my name is Zdeněk Šmergl, and I would like to introduce Amnesty International Osaka Group 95. We are a multicultural group communicating mostly in English language. And you can join us as a member or just to participate in our monthly meetings where we discuss issues connected with human rights and other Amnesty International topics. Feel free, please, to contact us and we can get in touch and introduce you how our group works, how often we meet, what kind of topics we discuss, and you will be more than welcome to become part of our group.
Thank you, Zdenek. And I'd like to also pass on my appreciation to both Marion, Zdenek, and both I-10 and the Osaka multicultural group for all the fantastic work they do. So moving along, I would now like to introduce the group that I am a very proud member of, the Amnesty International Nagoya Multicultural Provisional Group. So moving on to the next slide, if we could, 3 questions I guess, people might want to ask when being introduced to something or if they're being asked to consider joining something is who the group is, what do they do, and where do we meet? So we were founded in August 2019. We were basically founded to allow those who can't speak Japanese to engage in human rights activism. Of course, we share all the principles of Amnesty International, but there are 4 different groups, Amnesty groups in Nagoya. So then there was no English-speaking groups up till now. Personally, as an organisation that encourages diversity of identity, nationality, gender, it was felt that this was a bit of a shortcoming, at least as far as Nagoya, and the group is founded for that. We are not necessarily an English group per se, we're a multicultural group. So we don't want people to be believed that we only, are looking for members from the developed North or the Anglosphere. Anyone from any language background is welcome, and that includes Japanese bilinguals. But one catch we do have is that we do conduct our meetings in English. We meet up every 4th Sunday of every month in person, and we also meet once online for basically a catch-up meeting. The in-person meetings are fairly similar to I-10 in that they are a discussion of issues, or at least they will be moving forward. We also hold online events, which has been quite prevalent since the onset of COVID, in-person seminars when hopefully COVID dies down, but we also have a podcast called Rentai-kan, which I will introduce a little bit later on, but we're also involved in letter writing campaigns and other events. Moving on to the next slide. Who we are. So I guess the best way of showing who someone is to actually show pictures of who they are. So believe it or not, in that bottom left corner, the big bald fellow there is me, but that picture there is a picture of our very first meeting. And as you can probably tell from the photos, we have increased in membership. A point of pride for myself is that the majority of our membership is female. It's across basically 7 different nationalities and across many different kinds of issues as well. So you'll see in those pictures there, we've got some in-person meetings and some online meetings there as well. Moving on to the next slide. One of the questions which was raised before, what do we do? These are some of the letters that we've been sending out as far as part of our urgent action. So in the middle there, you'll see some letters in regards to the cases of Giulio Regini and Mario Franco. Giulio Regini being an Italian student who was killed in Egypt a couple of years ago and whose, I guess, killers have not been brought to justice. And Mario Franco, a city councillor in Rio de Janeiro who was killed, and the assassins have been found, but it's been felt that justice hasn't been properly served and that the person who actually planned that particular assassination hasn't been brought to justice. And if you look on the far right, there's some letters we've done in regards to the Right for Rights campaign in 2019. Moving along to the next slide. So besides letter writing campaigns, we have been holding online discussion forums. So one online discussion forum we held in July of this year was called the Freedom Toast Cafe, and ironically the theme was human rights and climate change. At that particular event, we had a discussion panel with Professor Masao Takano from the University of Nagoya, from the Department of Environmental Science at the University of Nagoya, and Marinel Sumukubaldo, a climate activist from the Philippines and the founder of the first Philippines climate strike. So on top of that, we also release a monthly podcast called Rentai Kan meaning in Japanese solidarity. The first set of podcasts that we did involved the topic we're speaking about tonight, but at the moment we're recording a 3-part series on the Black Lives Matter movement in Japan. So we just finished our first episode of that about the history of the Black experience in Japan, where we had 2 professors, Professor John G. Russell and Professor Reginald Carney, to talk about that particular concept. Moving along to the next slide. We're very, very active on Facebook. We have 2 incredibly active and very, very energetic social media coordinators who update our social media platforms regularly. So if you're online, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Just type in Amnesty International Nagoya Multicultural Group, or our acronym AINMCG, and I'm sure you'll find us. Okay, moving along to the last slide. Now, if you are in Nagoya, we will be meeting up on October the 24th at 11:30 a.m. in Surumai Park. We're going to be having a picnic on that day. It's going to be the first in-person meeting we've had in quite some time. Participation's free, but we do ask that people bring their own food and drink. Unfortunately, sharing food and drink might not be a particularly good idea considering the current world health circumstances. A condition of coming along as well is that people bring a protective mask and have a temperature of around 36.5 degrees and that they are not displaying any cold-like symptoms. Also, as well, if people could bring 100 yen, we're going to be sending out an urgent action letter that we'll be revealing the contents of later. So if people could do that, that would be greatly appreciated. Okay, moving along to the next slide. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to this presentation, and if anyone wants to get in touch, the best 2 ways to get in touch with us are at the email and the Twitter handle displayed below. So looking forward to hearing from you if you are in the Nagoya area. Now, getting back to the topic of tonight's online seminar, human rights and climate change. Now, before we get started, I would like to mention that when speaking about climate change, there is a bit of a tendency for many people worldwide to consider that as climate change worsens, or at least under the worst possible circumstances, that the world is basically equally doomed. That resilient countries such as Japan, the USA, Canada, and Australia will feel the effects of climate change in a similar way to countries such as to countries in areas like sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, and nations that are low-lying nations. Now, if people are aware of the science, this is not necessarily the case. So what we've decided to do tonight is to get someone from the fourth category, someone from a low-lying island nation, Lavetanalagi Seru. Now, Lagi, as we will call him for short, is an activist in the areas of climate change, LGBTI, gender, and human rights. He is the co-founder of the Alliance for Future Generations, a group that encourages youth to be agents of change and contribute to the cause of sustainable development. And he's also a program officer with the Rainbow Pride Foundation. So without further ado, Lagi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you so much to the listeners who are joining in as well. So, as Glenn had introduced me, my name is Lavetnalang Seru, and I am from the beautiful country of Fiji in the Pacific, and I'm part of the Alliance for Future Generations, which is a youth network, and we work to provide a space for young people to be able to voice their issues and their opinions and thoughts, but also allow them to drive some actions and change within their own communities. I guess I'm privileged to be addressing you this evening, and I've chosen this particular topic, climate crisis, impact on human rights in Fiji. And the reason I use climate crisis is to draw attention to the issue, also to draw attention to the urgency. It is a crisis and an unprecedented challenge of our time, and my generation will, disproportionately face the impacts of the climate crisis for years to come. And something that we have little to contribute to. And maybe perhaps if we can go to the next slide, I would like to touch on the global context and sort of funnel down to sort of a national context. So at the global context, we have this list of documents and agreements that has been agreed to across the world. You have the Paris Agreement and the goal of keeping the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and also efforts to pursue, the states to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I think without the leadership of some of the Pacific Island leaders, such as His Excellency, the former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong, and the late Honorable Tony D. Broom from the Marshall Islands, we wouldn't have got 1.5 degrees into the Paris Agreement in Paris. We have the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, something that came out of the World War II. And we also have the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have 10 years to achieve, the 10 goals. And I think these are all great documents, whether it's legally binding or not, but it calls for more action from across the world as we see the kind of challenges, ecological and also economic challenges and social issues that we face. I've shared a few photos there, and the one to my the top left, that is the island. That is the island of Marshall Islands, and you can see that is the Runit Dome, which contains the nuclear waste from the nuclear test conducted in the Marshall Islands. And you can see how if we continue with business as usual and the ocean continues to rise, there's a danger that this nuclear waste will leak into the Pacific Ocean. And for us here in the Pacific, you know, we rely on the ocean, sustenance for economic livelihood, and all that. So these are the kind of issues that we are also facing in the Pacific. Across the world, you're seeing tropical cyclones and hurricanes and typhoons, the wildfires and the bushfires in Australia, in California. You know, these are grim realities, but also at the same time, we're really encouraged to see the kind of movement building led by young people, led by civil society, led by civil society and groups to push for more accountability at the global level. And we move on to, you know, sort of to the regional context. If you can move to the next slide, please. And we have these other frameworks. One which is the Boyd Declaration on Regional Security, and this was a agreement by the Pacific Island Forum leaders that includes Australia and New Zealand in the 50th Pacific Island Leaders Meeting in Tuvalu, which recognized the climate crisis as the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, the economic security and social security of the people in the Pacific. So we also have the framework for resilient development, which is sort of a voluntary, non-political framework that aims to guide and promote coordinated and integrated priorities and approach for regional, national, and sort of community at the community level as well, on how you can sort of embed risk considerations into sustainable development, sort of presenting a holistic guidance for the development of communities of practice and policy and programs. You know, when you look at the climate crisis and also disaster risk. So those are a few of the things that sort of like guides the work at the regional level. And if we can move on to the next slide, we come to sort of like the national context. So Fiji is a island state, small island state of 330 islands. And I think it's really important for me to share some of the photos that you have there. So our latest constitution was in 2013. We've had, since independence, 3 military coups and one civil unrest or civil coup in 2000, and has a critical, important role in understanding the climate crisis and the kind of impact it's going to have on the people. Now, the military takeover, the first one in 1987, was because of the racial divide. The indigenous people, which you call the Itoke, and the what's politically termed Fijians of Indian descent. So the Fijian of Indian descent were part of the Giramids, who were indentured laborers from India to take care of the sugarcane industry, who were working in the sugarcane industry. So in 1987, as part of Fiji's road to democracy, there was a military coup because of those racial and ethnicity divide. But also Fiji this year celebrated its 50th anniversary. And I think these are all important information as we go through the slide and how this sort of adds into the dynamics of the climate crisis and the impact it's going to have on people. If we can move to the next slide, please. So when we talk about human rights, you have the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is sort of like the overarching global document, human rights and international human rights law. Then you have the various treaties when you talk about the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Fiji has ratified most of these international treaties. If we look at these particular conventions and also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you'll see that Article 8, right to life, is not, it's what I have here in front of you in the screen is not from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. These Article 8, Article 38, for example, are from Fiji's own constitution. So I've sort of used, the local, the local context here. So these are from the constitution. If you, for instance, Article 38, the right to health, sort of is aligned to Article 25 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So how does the climate crisis impact on human rights? I guess one of the most recent experience for Fijians was Tropical Cyclone Winston. This was back in 2016. It was the strongest cyclone to ever make a landfall in the Southern Hemisphere. It was a Category 5 cyclone, and it almost cost the economy 1/3 of its GDP. Infrastructures were damaged, were lost, 42 lives were lost. So people got to recognize and understand the linkage between disasters and the global, the increasing global temperature, the global warming, and they're starting to make the connection that this is actually part of the natural phenomena that's caused by humans. And if we continue to see frequent and more intense disasters, what are the impacts on people losing their lives, people unable to reach health centers, and because of damage to roads and infrastructures. We have cases during Tropical Cyclone Winston where mothers had to give birth on the roads because they are unable to reach the hospital. There are many risks to this, and I guess when you look at the right to life as well, it's also looking at the vulnerables in communities. For example, the elderly. We are seeing, heat waves, and many of the elderly, some of the elderly are dying, out of stroke, dying out of, exhaustion from the heat. So as we continue to see these variations to the climate, we can expect that it could pose many health risks, and even after disasters such as the recent tropical cyclone Harold, we saw an increase in cases of leptospirosis, dysentery, and diarrhea. So these are the kind of health issues that are sort of like increasing after disasters. I have this photo on the slide where you can see, democracy and ethnic conflict in the Fiji Islands, and I think it's important to look at that because, like I said in the previous slide, Fiji has undergone, a few coups or military takeover, and this has been because of, the racial and ethnicity divide within the country. Now, with the climate crisis, as people begin to move, when you begin to see the kind of internal displacement and also the internal movements of people, but also those who are moving in from outside, the external migration into the country, what does that tell us as a country? Already, within this country, there's division over land, over resources, over who's taking, who's holding power and all that. But if we were to see country X come, the population from country X moving into Fiji, we expect to see this divide further sort of increase within the ethnicity groups. So those are, I guess, some of the kind of things I guess it's important to have at the back of our mind is the kind of national context and how this will play out as we see internal, mass internal, and also external migration into the country. And we see a lot of racial discrimination, and we will expect to see increase in cases of xenophobia being played out, and also discrimination. Particularly if you see those photos with the, this is from the Pride March last year. The LGBTQI community here in Fiji has often been scapegoated during and after disasters. There's this, religious sort of narrative that allows people to say, because of the kind of lifestyle that you're living, God has punished us, and God is, sending all these cyclones, and there's this thinking or rational thinking, well, not rational thinking, but thinking from public that God is punishing us through, climate change and the ocean warming. And I guess more work that we're trying to do is how do we actually let them know that it's actually not God, it's the humans who are causing this, and humans who will, disproportionately suffer from the climate crisis, and especially vulnerable groups such as the LGBTQI groups will expect, many cases of discrimination and violence and abuse of multiple forms happening if we were to continue to see, or if we continue with the. If we can move to the next slide, please. And we look at, right to housing and sanitation. And I think these are some of the very basic needs for any human being, including, right to adequate food and water. So with the climate change, we're seeing major food security issues in Fiji, and people are unable to access to nutritious food because of the exorbitant prices that's being sold in the markets, because after cyclone goes, it wipes out almost a quarter of our agriculture sector. So this again is a food security issue. When we have prolonged droughts, we have goat farmers who are crying out to government and saying, our goats have died because of the prolonged drought. What do we do about that? And it links to, this is their source of income. They're unable to put food on the table because livestock are dying, and crops are dying, or, with recent and frequent flooding, many of the farms are being flooded. So this is something that I guess for many young people and Fijians in particular are really concerned about. When you look at climate change, it might seem like a very abstract, far thing. They're like, okay, but I can't see climate change now. But what they do feel now is that they do not have access to food. They do not have access to water because of seawater, saltwater intrusion. They do not have access to housing and sanitation because a disaster has, torn apart their house. And, that photo on top was just from a recent visit to an outer island. They've worked really hard for a good part of their life trying to build that house. just for a disaster to take it down within 2 to 3 hours. It's just painful to hear the stories of people trying to rebuild their lives after this. Okay, at the right to social security schemes. So the FNPF is the Fiji National Provident Fund, which is sort of like your pensioners fund. So you put in money, and when you turn 55 years of age and you retire, you're able to access them. It's something you can fall back on. So after Tropical Cyclone Winston, we saw over 51,000 applications received by FNPF. Members trying to take off money so that they can go and rebuild their lives. And these are people who are still, within the working category, and some who've retired. But the issue here is, if disasters were to happen frequently, let's say within the next 10 years, you expect, one cyclone every year, these workers will keep on drawing from the funds. What does that leave them at the end when they retire? Do they have funds to be able to build their lives, to retire? So it's also sort of like a social security issue. And I guess not only people who are working, we even saw that with COVID-19, zoonotics, these kind of pandemics, because of unsustainable consumption patterns. People being laid off work and people having to move back, in particular with the LGBTQI community. The cases we sort of come across is, they've moved out of places where they've been excluded, their own families for some of them. They've built their life, they've been working a good part of their life. And then for, COVID-19 to happen and them having to, losing their jobs, unable to pay rent, and being, having to move back to the families that, they sort of ran away from or moved away from for the first. So there's a lot of pressure on them as well when they go back to the family. So these are the kind of real life issues, real life experiences that are happening, that we may not see, that may not be represented in charts and graphs and figures, but these are the realities on the ground. Can I ask if you can move to the next slide, please? So again, on the right to health, I've talked about the increase of the leptospirosis, dengue, typhoid, and also diarrhea. We are also seeing health centers being damaged, and people are unable to access life-saving medical services. They have to dig deeper into their pockets to find the closest and nearby hospitals and health centers to access medical services. And also the photo on my top right, this man bending down, we're seeing also increasing sort of a mental and psychosocial impact on bodies of people. When you look at farmers whose drought skills of their livestock, when you see a person, lose his home because of a disaster, or has to relocate from their own village and communities, the kind of mental and psychosocial, impact on their bodies is far-reaching. And people could resort to things like suicide, easy way out of these problems. When you look at COVID-19, what has happened with COVID-19 and young people losing their jobs and unable to pay rent, it could easily trigger the kind of mental implications on the bodies of people. But also, there's a whole lot more to that as we move on if we move on with our status quo, the kind of unsustainable production and consumption and distribution patterns, still churning up fossil fuels, and coal, and carbon into the atmosphere, we would probably expect to see more of these kind of scenarios to happen. If we can move to the next slide, please. Yes, the other thing we have also within the Constitution, Article 28, or Section 28 rather, is on the rights of ownership and protection of Itoke, Rotuman and Banana lands, the indigenous land. These photos sort of show you the reality when people have lost their homes, they've lost parts of their arable farmlands and having to relocate because of disasters. But also they have to, we are seeing, graveyards being engulfed by, rising tidal waves. Now, for Fijians, in particular, the indigenous people, the Itoke, when a child is born, in Itoke, child is born, they usually cut off the umbilical cord and the placenta, and they plant it with a tree. And that's the kind of connection that Itoke people have with the land and the sea. So when you have to tell an Itoke to relocate, it's not, and letting them know, okay, we'll give you a few millions for you to relocate. It's not about money. For, the Itoke people, it's about their cultural identity. It's about who they are as the people, of the land, as indigenous people, and how deeply connected they are. So these are, things of intrinsic values that, as a result of the climate crisis, sort of infringe on their rights to ownership of their own land. And you can sort of link that to the international, covenant on economic and social and cultural rights. People have the rights to, to have a culture, to practice their culture. So you could see loss in cultures as people begin to, to move away from their own communities. But also, when you look at migration, we also need to see, what's the implication going to be on the host communities, which, so those are the kind of things that we, I guess, we're slowly beginning to experience here in Fiji. And we've had, the Tuvaluan government buy land here in Fiji. So, already, the host community, how do they respond to that? Are they ready to receive people from Tuvalu? Or, sorry, from Kiribati? So I guess it's something that the leaders of today really need to think hard on as you consider, the respect to international human rights law, but also, the rights of indigenous people and the rights of, in terms of the protection of their own cultures and traditions. But in all these set of work, I guess many young people here in Fiji are sort of leading the kind of change that this world needs to see. And I guess most of the work that we do is try to raise awareness on these issues. I'm here in Mandi, and we've just concluded a 3-day youth climate change and human rights workshop, where we sort of like touched on the linkages between human rights and and climate change, and how young people can be the catalyst for positive change, how they can continue to ask the big policy questions, influence the policy and decision making that are being made, but at the same time are able to drive the kind of action that's needed within their communities. And if we can go to the next slide, I think for young people, they are leaders. They are leaders of today. They're not leaders of tomorrow. And the reason I say that is because having worked with some of these young people, they're already leading some really great initiatives within their communities. When you talk about adaptation and mitigation, the kind of innovation and creativity and ideas that's coming from them to be able to address some of these issues are beyond some of our imagination. They are change makers because they're creating change within their own homes. They're changing, they're relooking, and they're sort of also reimagining the kind of production and the consumerism. It's something that I guess is sort of like a global problem right now, because we have a throwaway society. So how do we actually manage our resources that are already limited? How do we become custodians and stewards of the land, of the sea, and protect not our natural environment, but also protect us from issues such as the climate change? And many of them are volunteering their time and their energy, and I think they're driven by the kind of passion because of the realization as well of the doom that they are bound to face if nothing is taken by the leaders of today. So they're holding governments accountable. They're holding the development partners accountable. They're infiltrating these spaces and they're trying to create change. One of a perfect example of what young people have done here is, the government of Fiji back in 2016 used to charge what's called the environmental levy, and it was 6%. So any tourist that comes in, or if you visit a restaurant with a $1 in sales turnover, you get to pay that 6% environmental levy. So we had this national budget consultation. We sort of like asked the Minister of Economy at the time and said, what do you actually use this money for? Because we have no idea what the money is being used for. So initially what the government used to do, it used to go into what's called the consolidated trust account. And government, as cabinet deems, will use that money, if there's a disaster, they pull it out and they use it for disaster response or for whatever the government thinks is urgent that needs to be financed. So we did a submission to government and said, if you're collecting it, if you're calling it environmental levy, then you need to start using it for that purpose of safeguarding the environment. The government increased the levy from 6 to 10%, renamed it Environmental and Climate Adaptation Levy, set up an Environmental and Climate Adaptation Trust account. So in the first year, it collected about 92 to 96 $1 million, and then it sort of gradually increased over the years, 112, and I think it was 120 million. And this particular fund is now directed to environmental and climate adaptation projects. So young people are influencing, the policy, but also are driving the change within communities. And if we move on to the next slide, you will see on my top right, that's what young people through the support from WWF had done in the outer island. This is a sort of a seawall that they've made out of quiet. That is made out of the husk of coconut. So they sort of like weaved that, and they've put it, and they formed this structure where to put by the beach to protect and sort of like acts as a natural not a natural, acts as a buffer against strong waves from eroding arable lands where they're sort of using for farming. And as I said, it's a food security issue. And also, if you look, one of the communities that I sort of went to some 2 years or 3 years ago was this particular community. They had to reclaim about 100 meters of land, and they had to build a seawall. And after the seawall, they had to plant mangrove. So the mangroves was a natural buffer system that was protecting the seawall. So sort of when the strong wave comes, it's broken up by the mangrove trees, and then you have the seawall. And so I asked one of the ladies at that community, is like, oh, what was the issue that you were facing that you really had to, reclaim this land, that you have to bury almost 150 to 100 meters of land? And she said, for us ladies, we normally, we don't go to the farm, but we do a lot of backyard gardening. So we plant vegetables, things that are easy to plant by our house. And they said, when the wave was coming in, because the wave was coming into the village, what it did was, it was bringing in these small crabs. And if you go out to a beach, you'll probably see these yellow, sometimes purplish crabs, very small. You walk to the beach and suddenly they run into one of those holes. So these particular crabs were eating away their vegetables and root crops. So this was an issue for them. And for them, that meant they had to move their farms more inland, meaning they have to walk a few hundred meters to access their farm, placing burden on their bodies. If you look at on the other side of ocean security, many, as we see the ocean warming, we are seeing a migration of fish stocks away from coastal communities, and women and men now have to dig deep into their pockets to pay for fuel so that they can go into deeper waters. Then there's also risk over their lives as they're out in the deeper waters, and they do it out of necessity. They do it to feed their families. They do it because they have to send their children to school. And sometimes when, this process of sending their children to school, as we experienced during Tropical Cyclone Winston, almost hundreds of schools were closed after Tropical Cyclone Winston. Children were out of school. So, when you talk about the right to education, when you look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, these are the kind of implications that has had on the education sector as well. But back to the slide, the young leaders are drawing from traditional and indigenous knowledge and wisdom on how they can better prepare themselves, how they can be resilient to the challenges that they are facing. But at the same time, they're creating the kind of advocacy and sort of policy influencing and demanding change. The government, not the government, but Australia, we know, is trying to move forward with this coal mine, the Adani coal mine, but that's going to have implications for us here in the Pacific. Okay, young people are also doing a lot of other environmental works, and also from one of the photos there at the bottom left, they're planting mangroves, and there's a reason we plant mangroves. It is, because of the multiple role it plays, acting as a natural buffer system against strong tidal waves. It's a natural ecosystem to many breeding fish and marine organisms, but also the fact that it absorbs 3 to 4 more carbon from the atmosphere than trees that grow on land, terrestrial trees. So that's one of the things sort of doing to sort of accelerate the sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere. So they're planting mangroves across the island. And with these particular young leaders, they've planted over 50,000 mangrove plants over the last 2 years. And there's a group that's targeting to plant 200,000 mangrove seedlings by the end of the year. So kind of commitment and passion from young people is, it's amazing. And I think I will stop there. And sorry, what is there? Okay, yeah. So I will, the next slide. So I'm just going to stop there. And just to, kind of summarize that the climate crisis or climate change will have a far-reaching impact on every fabric, the fabric of life for people here in small island states, people who are really vulnerable. When you look at the very, the marginalized communities, people with disabilities, sex workers, LGBTQI, single mothers, elderly people. These are the people out in the communities who have really little agency and resources to be able to cope with disasters, to be able to cope with, prolonged droughts, with water security, with health security. And over the years, we've seen that these issues are sort of being exacerbated by the climate crisis. And it's something that I guess needs the attention of people across the world to look, to hear the cries of the people, but also to assist, and advocate for the kind of changes that we would like to see manifested from the larger developed countries, which we undoubtedly know has a really big role to play in this fight against climate change. And Japan is one of those countries. China is one of those countries. The US, European Union, these are some of those industrial countries who need to sort of reimagine the way they work. They need to change. There needs to be a system change. And I think there's a lot of aspects to that. You can look at things like, the population growth, for instance. The population growth continues to increase over the years, and this is one of, the contributors to what we face today. Because as you have a lot of people on this planet, a planet that's limited in resources, there's a lot of need for energy, for water, for food. And so we are going to exhaust all these resources. We are going to dig deeper into the ground to find coal and fossil fuel to keep our homes alight and factories working and people employed. So I guess that's one of the things that we can look at. Population, how do we control that? And it ask us of things like needing to talk about what's commonly sexual reproductive health and rights, family planning. We need to look at individual and collective unsustainable consumerism, consumption, production, and also the distribution patterns. It asks us to reflect on our lifestyle. It asks us to vote in the kind of leaders who's going to progress commitments to advancing and accelerating the work around limiting carbon emissions and increasing ambition on climate action. So those are the kind of ways I see people can help you. Voting in the leaders who are able to advance climate action and ambition, looking at your personal lifestyle and choices, having the kind of uncomfortable conversation that many people would not like to have around, family planning and sexual reproductive health and rights, but also at the same time, integrating in this whole idea of resilient development. As we continue to build, to develop, how to ensure that development is sustainable but also resilient to the challenges that we face today. So I'm going to end there, and thank you so much for your attention.
Well, I'd also like to extend my most sincere thanks to you, Luggy, as well, for that incredibly illuminating and basically eye-opening presentation that a lot, unfortunately, within the developed north and in richer countries, say like where I'm from, Australia, a lot of what you've just put forth doesn't often make it into the public domain. So thank you very much as well. And we've been also getting comments from YouTube to actually say thank you to you as well, and how inspiring it is to hear how young people are the leaders of their elders and not just following traditional patterns to influence the direction of change. And just also there's been messages of thanks for sharing those stories. So as I'm certain I could speak on behalf of everyone who's tuned in tonight, thank you for that. And thank you also for the work that you've done and continue to do. Now, as was mentioned just before, we've been getting comments on YouTube and via the Facebook Live event we've been running. So if anyone would like to add any questions at any particular time, we'd be delighted to receive them. The amount of voices we can get into this conversation, the more enriching and more informative it will be. So please do not hold back in putting forward any questions you would like to ask Luggy. We've had people from all around the world. We've even had a comment coming from Birmingham, England. So it might show the reach of where we've actually gotten to tonight. In regards to some of the questions we've gotten thus far tonight, one question we've got concerns the Paris Climate Agreement and its 1.5 average raise in temperatures. Do you think that's a safe target for the world to adhere to?
I think for low-lying atoll nations in the Pacific, the 1.5 degrees targets, I could say, just the tightening end of a noose. Okay, so it's something of that kind of experience. You go anything higher than 1.5, and the noose tightens. Okay? So I think the larger developed and industrial nations have grown and have developed at the expense and at the backs of some of these countries. For example, the Pacific. We have a history of colonization. We have a history where not only British but also parts of Europe, the US have come in, colonized our countries, and have extracted much resources and have grown and developed as a result of that. And we here in the Pacific, we are trying to develop, we're trying to increase better living standards for people, allowing many young people to gain employment opportunities, to build a life of their own, have their own families, enjoy the natural resources around them, but we are unable to. We are unable to. Some of the families they're unable to because every day they have to wake up in the morning and there's water left at their door. So you have a farmer who has to wake up in the morning, and prays he doesn't expect that part of his livestock has died last night because of extreme heat, or to be in the middle of the night you have a flash flood or cyclone that destroys half of your hard work. So if you look beyond Fiji and some of the Pacific Island countries like the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, the Kiribati, I haven't been to any of these countries, but I've seen the photos, I've seen the videos. Young people having to, there was a story last year around, young people have to leave their classes to go outside and build seawall because they were expecting a king tide later that particular week. So it's a reality, it's a grim reality, and I think the larger developed countries and industrial nations have a responsibility to repay back to smaller island states. They have a responsibility to care for those who are vulnerable, to allocate the kind of resources and technology which allows these communities to thrive, to adapt to the changes we are facing, but also to lower their emissions. I think we've gone beyond a stage where countries, keep on saying, we'll decolonize, or we'll move away from coal in 2030, or we'll shut down the coal plants by 2050. I think this is just about the best time to do that. There's a lot of opportunities to transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy, and these opportunities for just and decent work around that as well. And I think there's a lack of globally political will. There's a lot of flowery, colorful statements that are being said at the UN, and a lot of commitments made by the leaders at the G10, the G20. But I think they're not putting, action into it. There's little to no action, and I say that because here in the Pacific, it's many of the young people, many of the communities are already feeling the grim reality and the brunt of climate change, and also sea level rise, food security, water security, health security. And if you extend that to see the kind of dimensions around cultural and civil rights and political rights, issues around discrimination that I've talked about, it's going to exacerbate. And I think many of the Pacific Island countries probably wouldn't be able to cope.
On that note, speaking in regards to the negative effects of climate change, I was recently listening to the Al Jazeera news podcast, The Take, and the episode that I was listening to involved the recent explosion in Beirut, in the factory in the port district there. Now, Beirut is a country that has suffered from years of civil war and has obviously fallen befoul of that particular incident. And I can remember one of the people interviewed had felt resentful in regards to people talking about resilience, in that people living within Beirut and Lebanon are so resilient, and that's something to be, admired. Thinking about Typhoon Winston, what's your gut feeling about that particular kind of, I guess, description of people living within Fiji? Do you feel in a similar way? I asked this because I've also spoken to people who have experienced basically the negative effects of climate change in other countries, and they've actually expressed similar kinds of feelings.
Thank you. I guess for the people here in Fiji, yes, they're resilient. They're resilient in terms of strength. They're resilient in the terms of the kind of will that they have. As families experience disasters, they tend to get back on their feet, carry on with life. But I think they would come to a point, if we continue with sort of like business to not control the global carbon emissions, and the temperature continues to rise, and we see the kind of changes to the climate, then I think we could look at the kind of scenarios where people would easily give up, where they won't be able to be resilient. And I've talked about this and said, a family that builds up put in so much effort and investment and resources and time into building a house, and then in a matter of few hours it gets flown by the hurricane, or there's a flood that washes away the foundation of the house, and landslide. Then people, when you look at the emotional state of being and the physical state of being, people will, you wouldn't be saying the same. You wouldn't be saying they're resilient, because you'll be looking at the kind of a situation where what we do not expect, would happen, would really be happening. And if you look at what's happening in the Marshall Islands, for instance, how would you say resilient if, due to sea level rise increasing, and let's say it covers up the Runit Dome, and that's the nuclear waste leaks into the Pacific Ocean, kills majority of the fish, has an impact on a health impact on the lives of the people in the Marshall Islands. I don't think so. You'll be able to say resilient in that case.
Just to cut in for one moment, Lagi, are you okay time-wise? Because we've been scheduled to go to 8:30, but because we've gotten quite a few questions, would you be comfortable extending the time you're spending with us tonight by 10 minutes, or do you need to be moving on at 8:30?
Yeah, sure. 10 minutes.
No, sure. Fantastic. So we'll extend that for 10 more minutes, because we've actually gotten quite a few questions. One question that we have gotten is Fiji witnessing aggressive fishing in the waters surrounding your country from other nations or areas?
Is Fiji suffering from aggressive fishing in your waters?
Maybe a better word would be invasive, because I guess to add a bit of context to it, with warming ocean temperatures, it's been found that fishes are actually swimming closer to the poles. So the migratory patterns of fish are changing. So I guess for countries that are reliant on the fishing industry, they may be moving towards, I guess, Fiji to actually get their fish harvest from there because of these forced migrations. So has there been any incidences of invasive fishing from other countries around Fijian waters?
Well, thank you. And I guess the question is something that's, I guess that issue is happening here in the Pacific. We are really small island states. We do not have the kind of resources that other countries have to monitor our waters. So, we have very small fleet of naval vessels to control and monitor our waters. So there's a lot of unregulated and also unregulated fishing vessels that are coming into the Pacific Ocean and are fishing. While at the same time we're seeing migration of fish away from coastal area, like coastal areas and coastal communities. Some of the communities that we've gone to and women have said, 5 years ago we'd go to fish and we'd come back home like 3 hours. Now we have to be out there in the sea for like 6-7 hours. So those are the kind of I guess experiences that communities are telling us, that goes to show that indeed probably there's a migration of fish. At the same time, because of the increasing warmth of the ocean, we're seeing acidification, coral die-off, breeding, and these are breeding grounds for many fish, coral reefs. And if they're dying off, the fish will not breeding in that particular area. They'll move out. So one thing is the impact by the changing climate and the warming ocean as the fish migrates, but also at the same time, we're seeing an increasing fishing vessels that are coming in from Asia, Southeast Asia, that are taking up all our depleting our fish stocks here in the Pacific, and they're using the kind of technology that not only takes the big fish, but also just anything that comes along its way, big, small, medium-sized fish. It all goes into the net. For the Pacific, as stewards and as custodians, when we go out, and these are forefathers that practices, we take only what we need for the day. We just go and fish today. If we need to eat fish tomorrow, we'll go back fishing tomorrow. So, it's totally, we're seeing the kind of practices that is very much opposite to our way of life here, not only in Fiji, but across the Pacific as well. So, but yes, I do agree that that's an issue here in the Pacific.
Okay. Just to also clarify, we've received a question as to whether the slides that have been used during tonight's presentation will be open for public access. We haven't really thought about that, but we will be sure to, if that is the case, to inform everyone via the Amnesty Japan website and via the social media platforms we publicised earlier from each group, if people are able to access tonight's slides. Another question we've gotten is that are there any cultural activities or traditions in Fiji which actually contributes to climate change mitigation? You were mentioning the mangrove planting, but is that 100% linked to a Fijian traditional practice? Or is there anything a bit more, more specialised to Fiji that actually does contribute to climate change mitigation?
Well, I guess the traditional way of life and cultural way of life for the Itoke, the indigenous people, and I am an indigenous uh, person, has been one of, like I said, our culture is our connection to the land and to the sea. So everything we do is around, gifting, knowing and understanding that the resources that we are given today is not only for us, but also for future. So and I just mentioned a good example just before this is like for fishing, in instance, when we go and fish, we only fish for the day. And it's the same for all other kind of work that a normal Itoke does in their daily life. Even with when we have our own traditional calendar, and the calendar tells you the different seasons, and we know when exactly to plant yam, and we know when to harvest yam. We know when to plant, when a particular fruit will be harvested or is in season. But these are changing. These, because of the disruption to the climate, these are all changing. So it's getting difficult for the people to keep track and know, when exactly do we do this, and when exactly do we do, this particular activity. And I guess the way of life for Itoke has been the same. We've always looked to nature as something that sustains us. So when we are doing all this work around mangrove planting, and coming up with the kind of ideas of building this kind of quiet nettings and structures to protect our coastal areas, I think it's basically just part of, it's already been part of our way of life. But I guess now this particular generation needs to sort of like revive many of these traditional knowledge and practice and wisdom, so that we can, be able to use them as, not only mitigation strategies, but also adaptation strategies. We have a lot of traditional concepts that can be used within communities to both build resilience, but also adapt to the kind of changes, the kind of environmental and climate change that we're facing and experiencing today.
I'm going to ask the next question as someone who was born in Australia. The Australian government from 2016 has been promising to step up within the Pacific region. Our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has referred to nations within the Pacific region as family. However, what do you believe the ongoing effect of Australia's perceived reticence towards climate change mitigation will have in the future? Do you believe if Australia continues its path, this would open the door to a nation such as China to become more assertive in the Pacific?
Thank you. That's a really good point that you mentioned Australia and China. There's, I guess, the first is with Australia. Australia sees itself as sort of like a big brother to the Pacific Island countries, and now they have the kind of Vuvale relationship concept where they look at one another. For the Pacific, being a family means looking after the needs of your other family members, and that's not possible when you're planning to go ahead with setting up and operating a coal mine which is to operate for 60 years and churning out the kind of carbon emission which is more than what all the 22 Pacific Island countries and territories emit in a single year. It's detrimental to our livelihoods. It's going to cost us our traditional value systems and cultures. If you have to see the kind of as people relocate because of sea level rise. But as we continue to see that, I guess the Pacific is in a position to also negotiate, with Australia. And I think the best summary to what I'm trying to say was mentioned by the army commander here in Fiji during a regional security workshop, and where he mentioned, there's three big powers in the Pacific: the US, China, and climate change. And climate change is winning when you look at the kind of influence it exerts on the Pacific Island countries. And I think the Pacific Island countries is in a position to be able to look at Australia and say, if these, the leaders have come out already last year and said, the single biggest threat to the Pacific is climate change. If Australia is not going to accept that, then, I think the Pacific should be allies with countries that can progress and advance climate action. And we've heard China at the UN 75th, where the president came in and said, we're going to put in more climate ambition. That's good news to the Pacific. What's not good news to the Pacific is Australia continuing on as business as usual. And I think the Pacific is in a sort of a position to be able to, to have a good talk with Australia and say, this is very unfamily-like to the Pacific.
A question we've gotten from YouTube is, will the Fiji government grant sovereignty on the piece of land that the Kiribati government purchased? I think it's the Kiribati government purchased on Vanuatu if the worst scenario happens to our people that have to relocate there. Your personal view, of course, will be appreciated. So could you please, talk to us about that?
That's a really good question, and I'll try to, I guess, answer that. As an Itoke, when in a community, and especially if you're someone new and you happen to walk into a village, you will see families calling out from their own homes, and come in and have tea, come in and have breakfast, come in and have lunch. They'll call out from their own homes. So I think the Fijian people, are very accepting and would very much welcome. And that's because we understand the cries and the frustration and the challenges that these small island atoll nations are facing. If they don't have anyone else, then Fiji could be that place. But I guess the thing here is around migration with dignity. How do they migrate to a place where they actually, the host community accepts them, allows them to be able to access kind of opportunities that they already enjoy in that particular community. So allow them to access services. So it's a really hard question. I think, and the Pacific Island leaders, they're already tussling over this, trying to figure out the best way to deal with this issue around migration. But I understand that they bought land, and I think that's to sort of secure a future for them. If uh, if things doesn't change.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so we'll wrap up with basically a three-part question. Last week, I read in the UK Guardian newspaper that there has been a phenomenon in the West called climate anxiety, a phenomenon where people basically turn themselves off from the enormity and dread of climate change. There's two ways it can go. Basically, people can become increasingly hopeless about the deluge of information that's thrown at them under the, doomsday scenarios. And there are people who can end up being incredibly optimistic and basically, I guess a good word would be hawk solutions such as vegan lifestyles, complete transition to renewable energy, whatever, on reducing their personal carbon footprints, be it as may. What is your take as to what a healthy and constructive approach is to tackling the climate crisis? Are you optimistic that we're taking this approach? And how, as people living in Japan and all around the world, how can we help Fiji in its battle to bring about climate change mitigation? That's a long question, so apologies.
It is. I'm trying to break it down, and I'll try to respond to that. I guess with the climate anxiety that's happening, I guess it's not only the people out in the Western world that are sort of experiencing that. Sometimes here in the Pacific, for some of like us who I work with closely, especially young people, sometimes they ask, is it even worthwhile what we are doing? Because we continue to do as much as we could, but these larger countries, if they continue to do business as usual, nothing changes. Our future is doomed. But I guess what I try to share with them is change is possible. And I think we need to cling onto that if we begin to change 1, 2 people and, influence others, we can instigate the kind of change that can change the whole system. We want that system. That's what we want. We want to, sort of look at the kind of economic models that we have that are putting, profits over people and planet. Okay. So how do we look at these issues? How do we address it? How do we, allow for the kind of leaders who are able to increase climate ambition, who are to commit to the limits of limiting coal and fossil fuel, and this is something people in Japan and other countries are able to do. They're able to I always tell young people here in Fiji is that one of the biggest power that you have is your voting power. When you go to the polls, vote for your future as if never vote, as your future depends on it, because it does. Because the kind of leaders that you vote in would either progress and advance climate ambition and climate action, or would side with corporations and businesses and continue to put profit over people and planet. And I don't think that's gonna make anything better for us. Ask us to reflect on our consumer, consumption patterns, even as individuals. Um, we live in a throwaway society where, you keep on buying goods and services for fashion and all this, and we do not realize that all these comes from a natural resource somehow. Either it's a mineral, or is it a tree, or is it from the ocean? We are extracting, and we need to control that. We also need to control, and the other thing we need to control is the population growth. I'm not saying that you should not, start a family, no, but we need to look at family planning. We need to look, we need to talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights with our young people, especially specific ways. This is considered a taboo, and this is something we're trying to break. And we're telling people is like, if you do not talk about it today, your children will be the ones to suffer tomorrow because of your silence today. And I think that's the kind of things that people in Japan could really help us with, and also holding their governments accountable.
Okay, and on that note, I think we'll finish up. I'd just like to thank Lagi again for taking his time out of his very busy schedule, basically to give this presentation and have this Q&A session with us. For me personally, it's been quite energizing and invigorating listening to you. Recently, I listened to a podcast where the former UK Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, was being interviewed in regards to his climate activism. And something he said actually really got my attention, in that he said sometimes being a climate activist can be a very lonely experience, that we are surrounded by so many different conflicting voices. I'm hoping we're hoping that one thing we've gotten out tonight is that everyone who's actually tuned in to listen to this conversation realizes that they're not alone. And knowing that people like yourself, Lagi, who are out there, that's very, very reassuring. And we thank you again for all the work that you've done and continue to do.
Thank you so much, Glenn.
My pleasure. And it's all our pleasure. Now, we could get through quite a few questions in the YouTube chat, and we'd like to put our apologies out now if we didn't get around to all of them. But please, this conversation will continue on the SNS platforms of the groups that we've introduced tonight, and we'll be putting out information in regards to human rights and climate change on the Amnesty Japan webpage. As we close out tonight, I personally would like to thank Marian Hara, Zdenek Shmergel, Lagi as well, Lagi Seru, Tanvi Kejirwal, Haruna Suzuki, for all the effort and time that they've put into this particular online seminar. You've been an absolute delight to work with, and I believe that we've actually produced something tonight that can be used as a resource, not merely an educational resource, but a resource for bringing out greater solidarity and effort into what has been described as basically the pivotal issue of our lifetime. So thank you yet again. And on that note, we'd like to close out. Thank you again, Lagi, and for everyone tonight, have a good night, and we'll hopefully see you sometime within the future.
Thank you so much, Glenn, and thank you to all the audience and everyone listening in, and to all the other facilitators.